Why do elections fail? Well, that's why we're all here, obviously. I took the title of the project. It sounds a bit strong, but basically what I'll be trying to do is to explain variation in election integrity in third and fourth wave regimes. Why would we be interested in this? I think many of you, having seen Pippa's presentations, already heard the strong reasons that we should look at election integrity. First of all, well, during the third and the fourth wave of democratization, third wave being the transitions starting in Spain and Portugal, followed up by those in Latin America. Fourth wave I refer to as the transitions that happened after the end of the Cold War, so the former Soviet republics, many sub-Saharan African countries. By now, almost 90% of countries in the world hold national, executive and legislative elections. So almost all countries in the world hold elections, but those elections vary widely in terms of their quality, in terms of their integrity. While they all meet de jure multi-party election norms, they all meet minimal criteria that international standards have specified for elections, we find a widely varying menu of manipulation, from the obvious ballot box stuffing to less obvious changes in electoral laws and intimidation of party candidates before the elections start. So there's a number of reasons why we should be interested in election integrity. What I would like to do in this presentation is discuss the concept a bit and then try out some explanatory factors that I'm still working on to develop. The concept is extremely difficult for a number of reasons. It takes a panoply of forms. Election integrity starts way before the elections and it ends way after the elections. We'll get to that in a bit. It includes both intentional and administrative irregularities. It's not very clear what criteria we should use, normative or international law-based, to judge irregularities, and the boundaries of the concept are also not that clear. To give you that drawing, I think that's best illustrated. The complexity of the concept is best illustrated by the sequential steps that an electoral process constitutes. And that's not just election day, it starts way before election day. By the way, this is a circle that Pippa uses very often, so to give you credit for that. But just to go through the steps a little bit, and these are not even all the steps that are involved in an election, but way before the election the legal framework is established, and often changed, especially in new democracies. Then constituency and polling district demarcation, where gerrymandering is, for example, a big problem. We get to voter registration, party registration. All this happens in the year or half a year before the election even. Then the campaign, during the campaign regulation, the polling day itself, and then after polling day, the counting and tabulating of the vote, resolving of election-related complaints and post-election procedures, and then that feeds into the next electoral cycle. So as you can see, this is a really complex process, which is difficult to grasp in a single concept of election integrity. It takes many different forms, violations of election integrity. And as you can see also in this graph, here it becomes apparent this administrative and the political dimension. So for example, voter registration is largely an administrative exercise, but in an underdeveloped country, if you don't have a very good civil registry, a voter registration exercise is much more work than the actual election. Likewise, imagine Congo, where you have to get a huge country where there's only plane traffic and you have to get polling stations to all the different parts of the country. That happens with donkeys, with bikes, by foot. It's a huge logistical operation. Think of countries like India that are just in terms of size already really big. So there's a lot of administrative aspects where elections can go wrong. And then there's the more obvious intentional cheating that receives more attention, like ballot box stuffing, opposition intimidation, these kind of things. Now, as you can see in this process as well, what criteria should we be using to judge each part of the process? That's not so clear. So what criteria should the legal framework meet? When is it a just legal framework and when not? What is a good district demarcation, for example? Then we come almost to judging what is a good electoral system, yes or no. Voter registration is a bit more easy because we have the definition of universal suffrage, so it should include as many voters as possible. But as you can see, along those steps, the criteria for judging when an election is of high quality or high integrity and when it's not is not even that clear. Going into those criteria a little bit more, what I distinguish in the paper, and that's very shortly done because I'm trying to cram a lot into the story, this should become a book at some point, so I'll have more time to explain. But if you look at the criteria, the normative criteria to define election integrity, we can distinguish either-or criteria versus matter-of-degree criteria. I would say the either-or criteria are the minimal criteria that are defined in international standards for elections. And those are very clear, there's no disagreement about them. And those are those four. So elections should be held for national offices, legislative and executive elections. They should be periodic, they should be irreversible, meaning there shouldn't be a coup throwing the elected government out, kind of obvious. There should be what I call de jure. At least the law should specify that there's universal suffrage, and at least the law should specify that multiple parties or candidates can run in elections. Those are the minimal criteria. But how useful are they? Because 90% of the countries in the world meet those criteria currently. So actually what we're interested in is rather those matter-of-degree criteria. And what are they? Well, they are much less clear. They are the conditions for participation in competition. Are voters intimidated? Are candidates intimidated? Are voters free to make a choice? Are there civil liberties surrounding the elections that make sure that this participation in competition is de facto also guaranteed? For example, freedom of movement, or freedom of campaigning, freedom of association. Are the electoral procedures fair? These criteria are much less clear, and that causes a lot of the discussion about conceptualization. For now, what I do is, well, you can see it drawn here. We've got the minimal criteria, the elections that do not meet international standards. Well, that's less than 10% of elections in the world at the moment. 90% of elections are on this side, and their election integrity varies from very, very fraudulent, very rigged elections to, say, clean elections, of which we all have a notion what it means, but when it comes down to really specifying what it contains, it becomes more difficult. So more work needs to be done there, but I didn't want to wait for that and start doing some empirical research at least. Before we go to the empirics, just one other problem about the concept still, the boundaries of the concept. And that's even apart from the criteria. So for example, think of an aspect as vote buying. Where does vote buying end and where does constituency service begin? So if you represent and if you take care of your own district and you make sure that there's policies that benefit your own district, is that representation? But if you buy vote, it's a very tricky distinction. Well, Susan Stokes does a lot of work on that. And there's more areas in which the boundaries are not that clear. So a lot of work needs to be done on the concept still. I outline a couple of concepts in that table. But we wanna not get stuck in this conceptual discussion too much. We also want to do some empirical work and see if we can anyway see if there's some variation in elections and whether we can explain that. So as a working definition for the moment, I take just the extent of both intentional and administrative irregularities that occur in elections as defined by international standards, both before, during and after elections. So if you look at an election observation mission, they will usually check that whole process, and during the process, that circle that I draw, they will identify irregularities. And based on that, if you read in a report like that, you can identify, well, there's lots of irregularities across the cycle, or there's a medium level of irregularities, or it seems to be relatively okay. It's a very crude distinction, but yeah, we have to start somewhere. So what did I do? I gathered data for 97 third and fourth wave regimes based on the existing data sets that were out there on election integrity at the moment. There's new ones being developed in this project, but these are the ones that are available at the moment. I put them all together, did some validity tests and looked whether they disagreed on election scores. And when they disagreed, I recoded it myself, and for missing elections, I also coded the data myself, and that results in a data set of almost 900 elections where I have this crude score. So clean, medium flawed, very flawed, as a way to start to get some ideas of what's going on. Well then, obviously, the most interesting part is why would they fail? Why would elections fail? So why would we find this variation from extremely flawed to rather clean elections? And in the paper I tried to develop some explanatory factors. It's not all that clear yet, but that I'll hear from you, I hope. Two dimensions are important. So is it because of lacking capacity or is it because of intentional manipulation? There's a huge discussion in the literature on this. Lacking capacity simply means not having the resources, not having the knowledge, not having the experience to organize elections, which is very real because it's a complex process, as we saw. The alternative explanation which many scholars follow is a more rational choice kind of explanation of intentional manipulation. So what are the stakes of the race? What can you win in the election? What are the costs of engaging in fraud? And can you get away with it? How many checks are there? Then the second way of looking at it is the long-term structural factors, or is it caused by short-term, more contingent factors? Is it long-term historical experience, for example? Do you have experience with organizing elections that will shape your capacity to organize clean elections nowadays? Or is it rather actors and contingent factors like the presence of observers, like an active civil society in the election at the moment that generates a clean election? Looking at that first dimension, this administrative dimension versus the political dimension, you could make a 4x4 graphic, and this is based on earlier work by Pippa, where you could say, okay, well, maybe we can group countries into whether they have low capacity to organize elections, high capacity to organize elections, and on the political dimension, whether actors have good reasons to engage in fraud and whether they can get away with it, versus whether they wouldn't have reasons because the stakes are not so high and there are many checks. This is difficult to put in one dimension, but you could come up with, say, in low capacity situations where there's high intentionality, both influence each other. So we have low capacity to organize elections. It's a mess. It's people don't know how to organize it. For example, in the case of Congo, all kind of procedures are not observed because you have to get the elections done, and it's just very difficult to get it done. This creates a lot of opportunities for fraud. So the two influence each other and then create lower election integrity than what you would have, for example, if you have high capacity for organizing, but you still have actors that want to engage in fraud. It'll be more difficult for them to get away with it. I don't explain this very well, but we'll get to it in the discussion. Then the other dimension that I try to look at, I try to put this administrative dimension, capacity, and the political dimension, say the will and the possibility to engage in fraud, into a more long-term, intermediate and short-term perspective. And there we can distinguish the phasing of causal factors, of why elections fail. So is it really these structural, distant causal factors like democratic experience or colonial legacy, which is a strong argument in the literature? Is it that your previous colony has left, say, British-style institutions, or is it that they have left no institutions at all? What kind of capacity does that generate to organize clean elections? How long is your experience with elections? Is it the first one you organize, or is it, say, the 20th one? That might make a difference as well. And then in terms of intentional or political conditions, we can find distant causal factors as well. For example, do you have a history of civil war? Is your country strongly divided socially? Is there strong social fragmentation, like ethnic divisions, religious divisions, that might make the race higher stake? You wanna win those elections because if the other guys win the elections, that means you're out of power, you're out of resources. See the case of Kenya. There, the ethnic component of electoral competition very strongly shapes the incentives to engage in fraud. Because if your ethnic group doesn't win, you're out of business the coming 4 years. Resource curse obviously also helps to increase that. So those are all very distant structural factors, and it's important to know how influential they are for election integrity, because they are very difficult to change. They're structural factors. We can't really do a lot about them. So if they are really important, that really limits our possibilities for practitioners and policymakers to intervene. Then there's a set of intermediate factors, what I call intermediate factors, which is rather the institutions, which obviously are more difficult to change, but they can change, and they do change over time. There, the administrative dimension would be, do you have an effective bureaucracy? Is your EMB independent, and is it capable of organizing an election? Do you have an independent judiciary that is capable of resolving post-election disputes? Those would be the administrative intermediate factors, and those are factors that can, in fact, be changed over time. It takes time, but you can influence them. The factors shaping reasons to want to engage in fraud would be, for example, presidentialism or majoritarian electoral institutions. Because if you win the presidency in many of these third and fourth wave regimes where power is extremely concentrated, this is really a big prize. This is really a high-stake race. Same for the majoritarian electoral system. You either win or you lose in a majoritarian system. In a proportional system, you might have less reasons to want to engage in fraud, and this is in fact found by Sarah Birch before. Well, then moving to the more proximate causal factors, those are, say, the conditions of the election itself. These are conditions that are structural in the country. It's a structural context in which a series of elections takes place. These are the momentary conditions of the election itself. So is there a peacekeeping mission? Is there election assistance that shapes the administrative capacity to organize elections? And then for the political conditions, who is observing those elections? Are there domestic observers? Are there international observers? Is the media independent? How strong is the opposition? That should all make a difference for whether or not you can get away with manipulating the election. So these are a lot of factors, a lot of variables. Just to summarize the most important expectations. In terms of capacity, if you have more administrative capacity, longer experience with organizing elections, I would expect the elections to be cleaner, so election integrity to be higher. If you have a high-stake race, low likelihood of detection, so lack of independent media, lack of people that are observing you, and low legitimacy cost, meaning it's easy to get away with fraud, even if it's detected, I'd expect election integrity to be lower. And both of these factors can be found in the long term, in the intermediate, and in the short term in terms of temporality. So what are the findings? Well, unfortunately, not something comes out in one or the other. Because this is the real world, so I find a bit of evidence for all of it, which is very annoying to shape a sharp story. But still, I think this is interesting. So what do I find? Well, I find bureaucratic effectiveness is very important. Previous democratic experience is very important, which is interesting because it means you organized, like in Latin America, you organized elections maybe just after the Second World War, then became an autocracy, then returned to democracy. That means still that election experience has an influence on the election integrity nowadays. And there's learning over time, so the more elections you organize, the better you get at it. In terms of the political dimension, I find really strong and consistent effects of civil war, religious fractionalization, and majoritarian institutions, so all factors that raise the stakes of the race, increase electoral fraud. Then again, that's counteracted by the likelihood of detection. So if you have an independent media, if you have an independent judiciary, if you have a lot of opposition parties, you don't get away with it. So election integrity is higher. And the effect of legitimacy costs are less clear. I don't find a lot of effect of international factors, but I need to look at that again. Long-term and intermediate factors are surprisingly important. I didn't expect that. So the structural distant causes are very important in explaining why elections fail, which is a bit sad because you'd hope that the short-term factors are more important. That gives us more influence to change things. I need to look at that again though. And I find a rather stronger path dependency mechanism, so elections that fail reproduce each other and elections that are clean reproduce each other, than a learning effect. There is a learning effect. The more elections you organize, the better you get at it, but it's much smaller in size than the reproducing effect. So what do we know? Well, to improve electoral integrity, we should increase the likelihood of detection. And their domestic checks and balances are important. Media, judges, vigilant opposition parties. We should lower the stakes of the race if we can. I mean, majoritarian institutions are not good. Maybe post-Civil War reconciliation, fractionalization is a problem. And we should strengthen administrative capacity. But I need to further analyze short-term dynamics, the impact of legitimacy costs, and most importantly, the relative importance of these explanatory factors, so that I can clarify, okay, this is what we need to focus on, instead of everything is a little bit important, which is what it is now. And then this is a broader agenda of what we don't know yet. If we would get better data, we could look at different types and actors of fraud and regional variation of fraud, but most importantly, we could develop explanatory models for specific types of fraud. So vote buying, election violence, for which arguably the explanations are different, and we might actually get a better understanding of what's going on than looking at the aggregate picture as I'm trying here. We need better theory, we need conditional models of electoral integrity. So when are different combinations of irregularities occurring together? Under what conditions do actors choose different combinations? And we need to look more at the repeated game. So the long-term perspective. You might want to rig an election in the first election so that you create an unlevel playing field, and then you need less fraud in the elections after that to maintain your power. And a broader investigation of the consequences of fraud. But that's a wholly different topic. So that's it for now. Thanks for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
May I join you?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Yeah, thanks a lot, Carolien. It's my pleasure to share a few thoughts on your paper with you and all of you. I really enjoyed your presentation because I think it is really at the very core of what we do in the project here that you have been joining for the last couple of months. And by the way, we're going to miss you terribly when you have to go back, unfortunately. So I really think this is at the core of what we do in the project. And I largely agree with most of the things that you've said. That means that the comments that I'm going to share are mostly a bit on the detailed side of your analysis and how you measure your indicators. Yeah, because the broad strokes I think are extremely useful. However, I think that this, as you yourself said, might be a little bit too ambitious for just one paper. It seems that you're really aiming for the book here, because what you're trying to do is to reconceptualize electoral integrity, reconceptualize the reasons and the explanations for it, and then run a quite complex model on testing those reasons. So this is really a lot, and well, maybe it can be put into several papers. So regarding the theoretical framework, the way that you order the different explanations for electoral integrity, and first of all, how you conceptualize electoral integrity yourself. So I think it's very valuable because it draws the attention to the electoral cycle as one dimension, the different intensities of malpractice, and the distinction between administrative and political sides of electoral integrity, I think, are also extremely important. However, I'm a bit hesitant regarding your working definition that you presented. I'm not sure if it reflects all those dimensions that you validly draw in your discussion. So one thing I'm curious about is whether your definition, would you characterize it as a positive or a negative definition? Because in the paper you say yourself that positive definitions of electoral integrity versus negative ones that focus on fraud would be better at recognizing the administrative aspect of it. Definitions that look negatively on fraud only focus on the intentional violations of it. So your definition draws on the international norms, and I'm also curious as to the reason why you emphasize this. You make the distinction between variations in electoral integrity, between variations in kind, either or, and variations in degree. If I understand you correctly though, and I'm not sure about this, in your analysis later on, you drop a whole bunch of elections that do not meet the minimal criteria. So that analysis, if I understand it correctly, cannot discriminate between explanations for the variations in degree and those that are in kind. Regarding the independent variables, the distinction between administrative reasons and political reasons is extremely useful, and I also think ordering them from distant to proximate causes helps a lot in just ordering the literature and the huge amount of possible explanations out there. So I have a few comments that regard mostly the political explanatory factors, the ones that influence the perceived need to cheat and the possibilities to cheat, because I believe that the administrative ones are relatively straightforward. I think that maybe you underestimate or underemphasize the international dimensions, the international explanatory factors a little bit. I mean, you certainly include them in terms of international legitimacy costs. For example, the foregone democracy contingent benefits, as Susan Hyde calls them. If you cheat and you are caught at it, you might not get the foreign aid or other such international benefits. But this, I think, is moderated by other factors as well that it might be useful to explore whether they make a difference in the model. For example, the geostrategic importance of the country. You mentioned it in the literature review. In the model, it's not there anymore because, of course, some countries are just much less dependent on such international benefits than others are. You try to capture that with the variable on international trade, because countries that are very dependent on this might be more susceptible to international pressures. But just, for example, during the Cold War period, belonging to one of the two blocs might have a huge effect on whether or not international sanctions or international benefits would be turned against the country, even if it was found to cheat in the election. And I believe your data set includes times from before the end of the Cold War. Also, I wonder if there might be maybe sort of a spatial or regional contagion effect, as, for example, in the Arab Spring or in other just regional developments where several countries together suddenly democratize, let's put it like this. This might be also a moderator for this international pressure variable, because as Judith Kelly notes, international monitors might have this glass house bias, meaning that if they are a regional organization, they are much less likely to criticize an election in their own region, because then when they hold elections, they might also be criticized for them. Regarding the domestic aspects of the possibilities to cheat, I wonder what happened to the variable civil society. That is mentioned in your theoretical framework, but then more or less dropped in your statistical analysis. I mean, you include things like the strength of opposition parties, which is certainly a proxy for that, but there might be other things that affect the effectiveness of civil society to put pressure on a government if it is caught cheating. So, for example, the media, as you say, play a huge role, and it might be useful to look into things like internet penetration rates, for example, to look at the effect that these new media play in this, because I think the variable you use is independence of the media, and you look at the traditional media only so far. How do you address the actor dimension of malpractices? In most of the literature, at least from my perspective, we always look at the incumbent being the one cheating and forging the election. And the arguments about international pressure and so forth work very well if it is in fact the incumbent cheating. But what if the opposition is cheating? I'm not sure how much this is addressed in the literature. I'm just getting an overview over that, and so I'm interested in how you would address this. So would the different explanatory variables also explain the integrity of elections if opposition parties cheat. Maybe this is more relevant on like a local constituency level, not in the big national picture. But if you look at the disaggregated picture, especially in majoritarian legislative elections, certainly opposition parties have just as many incentives to cheat, I would say. And just the examples that I know in Southeast Asia certainly show that opposition parties are very likely to cheat. Mm-hmm. Cheating is just all across the board, especially vote buying. I would like to make a side note regarding one explanatory variable that you mentioned and then not include, and that is geography. I think that you try to capture it by looking at the level of economic development as a proxy, among other things, for this. But you yourself mentioned the Democratic Republic of the Congo and saying that things like access to polling stations and the sheer size of the country, infrastructure and so forth, might play a big role in the administrative dimension of electoral integrity. So I would really emphasize this point and try to maybe measure it or approximate it with some variable in your data set. And I think it would be useful to use the rate of urbanization for that, perhaps. Just to get a very rough picture of how much of the population lives in cities and how inaccessible maybe the rest of the population might be. And by the way, this might not only be about the administrative component, but also about the political one, because vote buying might be more salient in rural constituencies than in urban ones. It's probably debatable. Just one anecdotal thing that I found in Thailand. It's just very difficult for canvassers to come to voters' homes to pay out money or to buy their votes because they can't get into condominiums. But you can just walk up to somebody's house in the village, which is quite easy. Okay, but again, that was just a side note, I suppose. Moving on to your measurements and the indicators. Again, I have to emphasize that I think it's hugely important that you distinguish or that you make sense of just the variety of explanatory variables on this distant, intermediate, and proximate scale. And I think it totally makes sense that your political factors are more among the proximate factors, whereas the distant and structural factors are, of course, by nature more administrative. The way that you order them, I totally agree with. Just a few notes on this, or questions maybe. Why is media independence, why do you put that under the proximate factors and not under the intermediate? Because independence of EMBs and independent judiciaries are in the intermediate factors. Okay, they are regulated by law, but so might be the independence of the media. Since I'm not so familiar with the ethnic and religious fractionalization index that you use, I'm wondering, and I'm curious about what it actually measures. Does it measure fragmentation or polarization in terms of religion or ethnicity? Because just from previous research in civil conflict literature, I know that it's often said that polarization is the one factor that leads to more proclivity to conflict, and it's not just fragmentation. So just a question about how you measure that. How do you measure the presence of international monitors? I think you say you use Bjornland's data set, and I'm curious about whether you think this is more useful than the one developed by Kelly and Kirill, the data on international election monitoring that also came out a few years ago. And then finally, moving on to your methods and analysis. So actually, I cannot comment much on your statistical analysis, and I leave it to much more qualified people in the room to go into the details on that. I think you do mention the problem of collinearity between the explanatory variables, and you try to deal with this. Since this is a work in progress, I'm very sure that you'll find innovative and creative ways of dealing with the problem of collinearity. Again, just a clarification question. Do I understand it correctly that you drop all the elections from your analysis that do not meet your minimal norm-based, international norm-based criteria? So just to reiterate that questions. Out of your numerous explanatory variables, you mentioned that some of them are constant and some of them vary. So I'm not quite clear about which ones of them are constant. Is it only the distant structural factors, or are there other constant factors among the independent variables? And I believe this relates to the story that you're telling in the paper and to the fact that it is a very big undertaking. So there are just a few spots there that leave a couple of questions open in this regard. Which variables and so forth. Finally, the only comment about your results that I have regards one result that you didn't show us, I think at least. Maybe I missed it in the presentation. And maybe it's one result that was not expected. The result that the closeness of the race, which we would expect to decrease electoral integrity because the stakes are very high, and the closer the race is, the higher they become. But contrary to that intuitive expectation, I believe that it actually increases electoral integrity in your model. And that obviously is a very interesting finding, and one that needs to be researched further. Just one thought I had about this is that, okay, the closeness increases the stakes, but not only for the incumbent, also for the opposition and for civil society. And it might increase efforts by civil society to pay ever more close scrutiny to the election, because they all of a sudden see a chance that there might be a turnover. I don't know if this is a suitable case for this, but looking at Malaysia, for example, that where all of a sudden the chance of a turnover is even there, however likely it is, we at the same time see just an explosion in citizen monitoring initiatives. Which of it came first, I don't know, but so it might be worth exploring that. It might also be worth exploring this by separating the data set into presidential and legislative majoritarian elections, and then on the other hand non-majoritarian ones, because again, looking at the local level, of course majoritarian constituencies are very vulnerable to this argument of the closeness of the race, because if we think about just the local dimension of a constituency election, it really is about who becomes the representative of that constituency. So that means there are high stakes, and they should be higher the closer the race is. But the same argument should not hold true for non-majoritarian legislative elections. So to sum up, I learned a lot reading your paper, I really did, and thank you so much for sharing it with us.
I'll respond, no? Yeah. To a selection of questions, if you don't mind.
Please, yeah. Sorry for being a bit exhausted.
Thanks, Max. This is fantastic. No, it's really great to have such detailed comments. I will respond to the ones that I think are most important. Maybe going backwards, because I have too many of them. So in terms of measurement, I think the closeness of the race, it's very important. It's the competitiveness of the actual election, where you would expect, actually the literature also specifies these two effects, no? The stakes become higher, so fraud might become higher, but at the same time controls are stronger. So fraud might be lower because of that. I really like your suggestion for a conditional effect depending on whether it's a majoritarian presidential system or a proportional parliamentary system. But I think what this shows also is a problem of measurement and a problem of something that I didn't take into account here, and I'll explain why, is the difference between regime types. So first of all, the measurement. I measure closeness in the race in the previous election, because closeness in the actual election is the outcome, and so influenced by election integrity. So I need to measure it in the previous election. But in 3 years, in 4 years, everything changes, especially in new democracies. Which means that measuring closeness by the previous election is really, really problematic. Actually, I should have polling data, which obviously we don't have for most of those countries, to measure the actual competitiveness of the race. So what this effect shows is that the closeness of the previous race constrains election integrity in the next race. And what does that show? That if your election was more competitive previously, the next election is likely to be cleaner. And that indicates there might be a difference between electoral democracies and electoral authoritarian regimes. That difference is there. I try to throw it into the audience because you might have some ideas. I try to separate the analysis looking at electoral authoritarian regimes and at electoral democracies. The problem is that the very definition of an electoral authoritarian regime is endogenous with election integrity, because they are the ones that have not clean elections, and electoral democracies are the ones that have clean elections. So separating the sample it's a bit nonsensical. So I have to, probably with case studies I can get a better grasp of that, but that's something to think about further for sure. As regards your question about constant variables, yes, those are the structural variables, so the ones that are far away. As regards the sample, yes, I look only at the elections that meet those international criteria. It's 90% of the elections, and the other ones simply don't vary. They don't even meet the criteria to be considered democratic. So you could, I don't think they are relevant to look at. And as regards collinearity, I actually corrected for that. I took that into account. So the variables that are collinear don't go into the same model, because you will get nonsense results. Yeah, then for the measurement, I'll leave that, I think. Geography was a very good suggestion to look at rate of urbanization. Your argument about vote buying is more likely in rural areas, yes, but some of the case studies also show it's actually more likely in urban areas, because you have cheaper ways of intimidating voters in rural areas without paying them, and in urban areas you might have to pay them to get to vote for you. For example, historical cases of Spain and England show that vote buying was higher in urban areas, so that's a bit tricky. As for the actor dimension, yes, of course, opposition and incumbent engage in fraud, both of them. I forgot to mention that in the paper, but for sure I look at both, because I look at the aggregate level. But I think really the next step is to look at specific types of manipulation, specific irregularities, and also look at, was the incumbent doing it? Was the opposition doing it? Under what circumstances? Do they use which kind of strategies? For example, Michael Breton shows in Africa that opposition tends to engage in violence, because it's cheaper, presumably, whereas incumbents tend to engage in vote buying. These kind of more conditional, but okay, that's the next story, and we need better data also, which we don't have at the moment, but we'll be having when the expert index comes out, I hope. As for international factors, yes, I think you're right. The problem is they are conditional. So in an aggregate analysis, you will find very weak effects. For sure, there are regional contagion effects, by the way, in both directions. I mean, think of Hugo Chavez and all the tours he made around Latin America. He for sure passed some tricks on to the Bolivian president and maybe some others. I mean, I can't prove that, but I have this idea. So that is something certainly, as I noted, to look further at. As regards the international observers, just to make that clear, the data are derived from those observer missions that are known to have very high standards. So only OSCE, EU missions, the Organization of African State missions are taken into account. I don't look at CIS, African Union observer. I mean, they are nonsense. They ratify any election, and the work by Kelly and Hyde shows that. So those are not good sources of data to use for identifying irregularities. And then the definition, the working definition, I would say, that's the interesting thing. We all speak a lot about conceptualization, and everyone is engaged in how to conceptualize, and there's a zillion different conceptualization, as you can see. In the end, when it comes down to measurement, we all measure the same thing. So we measure the same kind of irregularities. We all focus at irregularities, so what is wrong with elections, not to what degree competition is possible. So that's why in the end, as a working definition, I say, look, I'm just going to focus at the irregularities because this is what observer missions measure. This is in the end the people that measure election integrity measure, regardless of how they conceptualize it. So there's a bit of a gap there between a lot of discussion about the concept, whereas when it boils down to the practical level, we all measure the same thing. That's it, I think.